Hi, I'm Tracey Sainsbury. I'm a member of the European Fertility Society Education Committee and a fertility counsellor and host tonight of IVF Life Stories. And I'm delighted to be joined by the amazing Hayley King, creator, founder of All Things Donor Conceived, and also one of the directors of Path to Parent Hub and operations manager there too. But also, what lots of people might not know is that you're both donor conceived and have donated eggs as well. Welcome.
Hi, Tracey. Yeah, just to say, like I say, I'm donor conceived, but I've used sperm donation to build my family. So I'm not actually a donor myself. That's probably the one thing. It's the one thing I haven't done.
Apologies.
I'm probably getting a bit old, sadly, to donate my eggs now as well. But, so I think that ship sailed. But no, I'm very much, like I say, a late discovery donor conceived person. I found out quite late in life that I was donor conceived through sperm donation, but also, say, more recently, I'm a mum thanks to two amazing children thanks to sperm donation. So yeah, we're both
Congratulations on the arrival of your own two little people.
Yeah.
Where you mentioned discovering about being donor conceived later on, how was that? Is a big question to start with. How was that for you about discovering you were donor conceived?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in the very early 80s to my wonderful mum and dad who had IVF treatment. They were quite fortunate and when IVF was really brand new. So I came along only a couple of years after Louise Brown. So I knew growing up that I was what was called a test tube baby. My parents sort of sat me down because there was lots of, like, if you can appreciate, Tracey, back then it was quite a novel thing.
It was magical.
Yeah, it was, exactly. And I was seen as a bit of a miracle baby in that sense. There wasn't actually that many people conceived through IVF at that time, because even though we had Louise Brown, it did take some time for there to be regular birth through IVF. So my parents brought out all these sort of newspaper clippings of me when I was probably about 12. And I remember it being quite a distinctive event, but they only told me the IVF part. And then obviously fast forward about 20 odd years, and I was in my early 30s. Sadly, as part of a family argument, I was told then that as part of that very early pioneering treatment, an anonymous sperm donor was used. So my amazing dad, who I still have an amazing relationship with, sadly, I found it out that he wasn't actually my genetic father. And I mean, people have asked me this quite a few times over the years. So I found out 10 years ago now. So some time ago. But when I first found out, it was completely life-changing, without sounding too dramatic. It really was. And I often describe the feeling as almost being like a before and after event. So I often think sometimes when I'm reflecting back, almost like, oh, that was pre me knowing I was donor conceived. And then actually now I know it's like post. It was that profound on me. But actually, because I was conceived in the UK pre the HFEA, which is our regulatory body, where that was only brought in the 90s, and I was conceived way before that, there was no information. So I didn't really have any choices really at that time to find out any more information about who this donor was. So I was kind of left really a bit out at sea, I would say. I didn't really know what to do with that info. So it's quite a difficult time.
Was there any, I know the organisational structure around finding genetic half-siblings or the donor via DNA testing was in its infancy 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Where you were out at sea, were your parents able to share the name of the clinic so you could have contacted the clinic to see what was available?
Yeah. And at the first point, it was, because you can imagine it came out in quite a difficult way. So there was lots of family conflict there. But I did know that I was conceived at Bournehall, which was obviously the first IVF clinic that was established. And my mum's fertility doctor was actually Robert Edwards. So I knew that information. And I laugh about it now, but my first thought, because when I found out I was donor conceived, is I actually looked at a photo of Robert Edwards, would you believe, and thought, oh, because you hear these stories about the doctors being used as the donors and all this kind of stuff. Thankfully, there's no plot twist. He wasn't my genetic father. Yeah, I didn't really have much to go on. There was no official records. Like I said, there was no, I was really confused about where to go to get advice. I didn't know anyone that was donor conceived. I didn't even really know what donor conception was, actually. It was quite a strange concept to me 10 years ago. But what I did is I did ring Bourne Hall, actually, and spoke to a lovely lady who didn't really know what to say to me. I tried my best to explain the situation, and her kind of response was, well, you need to get in touch with the HFEA. But obviously the HFEA couldn't help me because I was conceived pre their establishment. But I eventually, through lots of jumps, lots of hoops, I didn't really know. There is actually a facility now that you can, like I say, you can try and find information out through if you're born after 1991, but pre that is quite difficult. But there are various commercial DNA sites that you can now use, which is what I ultimately ended up doing. But a number of years after I found out, because like you say, Tracey, back 10 years ago, there were things like ancestry.com, your 23andMe's, but they weren't really widely, I didn't really know much about them. I didn't really understand how it worked. And they were also really expensive.
I was going to say they used to cost hundreds and hundreds of pounds, if not thousands, a while ago. Yeah,
and the databases were very small in comparison to what they are now. And again, I just don't, at the time, I think it was such a shock, the whole, to try and process that information. I kind of didn't really do much digging after that. I thought, right, well, I'll never know who he is. I kind of just got to put that to bed. My dad is still my dad, which didn't really, change those things. But I had a lot going on in my life at the time. And I think it was too much to process, if I'm honest. I kind of put it in a box and moved on at that point in my time. And it was only, like I say, actually several years later, when my wife and I were looking to have a family. So I'm married to a woman and have been with Jez, my wife, now for some time. We wanted to have a family, and it was like, okay, we're going to need a sperm donor. And it kind of brought up those feelings again, I suppose, around what we were going to do, what type of donor we were going to use potentially, and those kinds of things. So, yeah.
And when you were planning for your own family, did you consider a shared motherhood journey, or did you plan how did you decide who was going to do what?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, Tracey. And to be honest, we weren't really given the option. It wasn't really discussed about reciprocal IVF. And I know that sounds a bit strange now because it's quite common for gay couples to go through reciprocal IVF, where one partner will carry and will use the egg of the other partner, usually with the donor. But yeah, I think even like 8 years ago, when my wife and I started to go down the route of starting a family, it wasn't really even suggested by our clinic. I'm not really sure why, but I think one of the reasons was that my wife had gone through some medical tests. She's a little bit older than me as well, and it was established that she had quite a poor AMH, which I know is a little bit controversial now, whether or not that's a good indicator of fertility. But at the time, her AMH levels were quite low, or very low actually, for her age even. And she was approaching 40 at this point. And we were pretty much said, we were told, if you want to have a family, and my wife wanted to carry a pregnancy. I think that was something that we had discussed, and my wife had always sort of dreamed of being pregnant. And it just was a bit of I suppose, an easier option to just use her eggs as well. It wasn't, I as someone knowing that I was donor conceived as well at this point, I knew that I could love somebody like my dad, who I didn't share genetics with. So it wasn't like I didn't feel a huge desire that we would create a child using my genetics. So yeah, we just went down, we went straight to IVF, and we're extremely fortunate. On our first round of IVF, we had twins. So yeah.
Oh, I love a good news IVF story, because so often we hear long dramatic stories. So beautiful to hear that. One of the questions that's come in is, why did you want to know who your biological father was? Now, I always acknowledge donors never intend to be identified as biological fathers. They donate because they want to be identified as a donor. But one of the reasons I asked about your pathway to parenthood was because, was it important to know the genetics when considering your fertility plans, and it feels actually that wasn't as significant for you. What did drive you to find out more?
I think so. I didn't actually DNA test or find any more information out about Jonathan, who is my parents' donor. So he was the one that donated anonymously, obviously many years ago. It was only when our children were born I started to become really curious myself, and I think because having children is such a life-changing event anyway, and I had these two little people that were about 2 years old at the time. They were starting to talk, and my wife and I had a real sort of serious discussion, like you do sometimes, and like, right, we really want to do things differently. Of course, we're going to disclose the fact that our children are donor conceived, and to a degree, in a 2-month family, that kind of is going to be taken out of our hands at some point in the future anyway. But actually, we're going to be really proactive in the talking and the telling, and almost take it another step further from kind of pushing against, I suppose, what I'd experienced sadly with my own family, with my parents, where there was still a lot of shame there. Certainly, even though the truth had come out, it was such a difficult conversation with my parents still. And I didn't want our kids, who were also donor conceived, to feel like they couldn't, if they were curious, to talk to us about it and show that level of curiosity, because they didn't want to upset us as parents. And I think at the same time, I also became very curious about who Jonathan was. And like I say, it was at that point. And again, I think it was a bit of a few things going on at the same time, where the DNA kits had come down quite significantly in price. They were more accessible. And I'd also, since then, Tracey, just to put it into some perspective, I've been able to join a number of online support groups for donor conceived people, and also parents through donor conception, where there was lots of discussion online around potentially how you can identify previous anonymous donors, rightly or wrongly, through commercial DNA sites. So that's kind of how I came to that decision to send my kit off. And most of it was the motivation. I had my own level of curiosity at this point, which, some donor conceived people feel more strongly than others, and they feel that curiosity maybe at different points in their life, even if they've always known. So, yeah.
And that level of creativity, that desire to want to find out a bit more, the curiosity, was it quick and straightforward, or was it a bit of a journey?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've got the two parts, the emotional side and then the practical side of DNA testing. I suppose the emotional side, I didn't really know what I was going to find. So that was quite difficult. Like, I didn't know if I was going to be part of a really large genetic sibling group, for example, because you do hear these stories. I didn't really know who the donor was. All my parents were told was that he was potentially a medical student who had similar colouring to my dad. So, whatever that means. So I really didn't know what I was going to find, and there was quite a lot of apprehension there. But the practical side, I suppose, it's not easy to find information out from a DNA site unless so for anyone that's watching that's not familiar with these kits, you essentially normally take a saliva swab, which isn't particularly pleasant, but you fill a tube up with saliva, you send it off, and what they do is they compare your DNA to other people on the database, and they give you a percentage chance of relationship match. So they might say and they call it centimorgans, which is how we compare DNA comparisons. And they'll match you with people who you share DNA with. But of course, you don't know who these people are potentially. Some of the relationship side of it, whether a cousin or half sibling or anything, they're predictions, so they're not always entirely accurate.
Yeah.
And the practical side of actually navigating a DNA site when you've never done it before, there's probably some people here that have maybe tried. It's actually really quite overwhelming and quite confusing if you don't know what you're doing. So my wife and I did spend many, many weeks kind of trying to teach ourselves how to interpret the genealogy results and family tree work. And eventually I was able, through, like I say, lots of looking at census records and reaching out to people that I had matched with on the site, like distant relatives, and like a big puzzle, if you like. And we were able to potentially narrow the donor down to a set of brothers. And funny enough, they were both doctors. So I was like, right, it's got to be one of them. And and one of them was. So.
And how has contact been initiated with your donor? How has that grown and developed? Because I believe now it's really positive. It is positive for both of you.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate, and I will say that I think people of my generation that were conceived through fully anonymous donation, obviously Jonathan, who was the donor, he never signed up to be found, and that generation, we could never have foreseen DNA testing, for example.
No.
But he wasn't on the DNA site. I was able to find him through a half first cousin once removed or something, which was the link. And I was very fortunate that he was quite welcoming. And again, thankfully for my situation, he actually had always been quite honest with his partners through his life that he'd been a donor. He didn't actually have children of his own, which again, I think having spoke to other donor conceived people that have been able to find the donors and their, the genetic side, that person has maybe had their own family and never told maybe a wife or a partner or their own children, which causes a huge, understandably, issue for that person. But for me, I think there was quite a lot of, like I say, Jonathan had always been open and honest with his family and friends. He's actually a gay man, so like I say, he never had children on his own. He was just very welcoming, and he said he wasn't particularly surprised. He kind of thought that this day might come at some point, and ultimately he was very welcoming and was able to answer a lot of the questions that I had. And we are still in touch sort of 4 years later, loosely in touch. We don't see each other all the time, but it's been, when I first met him, it was almost like looking at a familiar stranger. The kind of the resemblance between us is quite striking, actually. And it was quite a strange process.
And quite a few of the other donor conceived people I've worked with who found half siblings have had that similar sense of being a familiar stranger.
Yeah.
Have you found half siblings as well? Does he know if there are more?
Yeah. So through commercial sites again, initially there wasn't any matches on Ancestry, but there was a potential half sibling, half sister on one of another DNA site, and I was able to reach out to her, but she pretty much didn't. So it was quite apparent, actually, from speaking with her. I sort of explained my story, and she said, "Well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't kind of match my family setup. There must be kind of a mistake." So it became quite apparent that she also didn't know. She was on this site, but she didn't know she was donor conceived. And that was really difficult because in that moment, I suppose you're torn between potentially wanting to find out who this person is, but also you could potentially destroy the world that they know. And that was really difficult. But since then, I've had 2 other half brothers come up on Ancestry. One, again, didn't know he was donor conceived until he matched with the rest of us on there. And also one half brother did know he was donor conceived, and he decided to test because he'd just become a bit like me, had become curious. But that's been very complicated because we're all obviously born within 2 years of each other. So there's 4 of us at the moment, but we call this time of year like sibling season because people get given DNA kits and stuff for Christmas now because they're so cheap. And sadly, it's always like a bit of a strange feeling because you think, oh, it'd be nice if there are, other siblings that I don't know about, and you want to learn a bit about them or have a photo. But then in the same breath, you're like, oh, do they know? Because potentially that same situation which happened with my half sister. I mean, technically she's not half sister. I don't really see as a sister, if you know what I mean. But it's just been that side of it's been probably more complicated than actually connecting with Jonathan, the donor.
Quite a few of my sibling groups that I've worked with professionally as a counsellor have said it's been a bit like cousins, that there's a genetic connection and a familiarity, and that everyone's parents embrace donor conception. But if you get on, you can become really good mates. And if you don't get on, you might still be interested and catch up, but it's not as big a deal as parents embracing donor conception might feel.
Yeah, I think I can kind of relate to that, Tracey. I think with my situation, because we were all sort of, when we connected, we were all late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah.
You know, you're all busy. We've all actually got our own children. And it was just, and obviously you've got that layer of complexity with the non-disclosure in some of those circumstances. So it's very difficult. But yeah, and I mean, I've met them all. And I've been with them when some of them have decided that they want to meet Jonathan as well. And because I was the first to connect with Jonathan, that one of the complicating elements has been, I've always been a bit of a gatekeeper of the information, because I had that connection with Jonathan. Yeah. And I was almost a bit of a go-between, which again was quite difficult, but also very personal, because I was there. So for two of my half brothers, they asked me to be present when they met Jonathan, which is such an intimate situation to be in. I felt very privileged that they wanted to be there, but I also felt it was quite a lot of pressure as well to facilitate that process, if that makes sense.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah, no, and it is, and then you get that feeling, and this is why I suppose now I'm quite an advocate of not so much parents connecting with their children's siblings when young, but at least trying to maybe find out who they are or where they are in the world, or some information, because finding that information out as an adult can be very challenging. And even if you're not connecting with them when younger, I think just making your children aware that they might have siblings is really quite a sensible step. Because otherwise you could get to 18 and not really know much, or not really have thought about it, and then maybe then inquire, and all of a sudden you're met with potentially dozens, and it could be another type of late disclosure type shock, if you like. So yeah, that's just another kind of layer to it, really.
We could talk for hours about the sibling things. I'm a mum through adoption and foster carer, so we look at trauma bonds in siblings that way, and just how the serendipity of life, that if that sperm had been allocated that way, I could have had your life. You know, it's that, how do you deal with that teenager if you are in touch earlier on? So every situation is so different. Just acknowledging people watch the IVF Life Stories podcasts from around the world, but all over Europe. It's so different in each different country with the different regulatory frameworks. Do you think there should be almost, this sounds a bit extreme, but global agreement around how donor conception is provided or talked about, or the global limits on donor conceived families?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could wave my magic wand, that would be an ideal. I can't see it ever happening in my lifetime, sadly, where every jurisdiction, every country was in some level of agreement. I think we've kind of gone, sadly, a bit too far to maybe whether to bring that back. But I do think there are some things that could be done, more of a collaborative effort. And I know there are some efforts at European level. There's been some discussions about, like you say, having limits on donors, not just say a 12 family limit in Denmark, 10 family limit in the UK, etc., but actually a limit which is sensible and in the best interests of the families, not in the interests of the fertility industry. Having a limit on how many families can be created from one donor. And I really think that would, like I say, benefit families and benefit donors as well, because I think regardless, even like you say, Tracey, quite rightly, every country will have its own laws. There's still lots of countries in Europe that still obviously only allow fully anonymous donations. But we are living, regardless of where we are in the world, we have potential access to DNA testing. So regardless of what the donors sign up to, there's a chance that they will be traced at some point. And if they've then donated to potentially dozens and dozens of families around the world, they could potentially through DNA testing be found and then be contacted, and that's not fair on the donors either. So yeah, I'm a big advocate for bringing in more strict kind of global limits. And
what I think is fascinating and so poignant is some of the clinics in anonymous countries have said, and you mustn't do a DNA test. But Jonathan hadn't done a DNA test.
No, so, exactly.
Again, that awareness of just how determined the drive to find out genetic information can be if you've got a little bit of information, your own DNA, and other people once or twice removed have done a test as well. It doesn't take much to track down the donor. So when we speak in the UK about donors being open with their families, it feels you've got a real insight into how impactful for the donor's own children it can be around discovering that their mum or dad donated as well.
Yeah, exactly. And they're also in a situation, like you say, that they might have genetic half sisters and brothers out there that they might know about. And then it's also the issue of their children. So it could be like generations down the line where one might DNA test and this secret comes out that hasn't been told about. So I think commercial DNA testing has kind of blown out the water any sort of thoughts that someone can remain anonymous again. And I do feel for maybe the historic donors, and it was one of those ethical, moral dilemmas I had myself of whether I send my kit off, because if, say, Jonathan hadn't been welcome in and had said, how dare you, you've kind of intruded into my life and I've now had to tell my family and this is, caused problems for me, that would be difficult. But that wasn't my reality, and thankfully that didn't happen. But I know lots of people where that has happened, and it's really sad. But I think now we know better, don't we? We know that DNA testing is out there. So really, I really struggle to see how places around the world can still offer anonymity. And also, I think research has shown that, yes, the level of curiosity does vary between donor-conceived people. Some aren't interested, but for the ones that are interested to know their genetic heritage, it can be really important for them to know that info. And I feel like obviously we should be moving more towards the open ID scenarios as opposed to still pushing anonymity, really.
I know. I was just thinking about that. One of the changes that the HFEA have proposed is around parents being able to access the identifying information of the donor from when they give birth. I mean, I think they mentioned that at the end of last year, it came out in a press release. If and when it happens, who knows?
Yeah.
But do you think that level of transparency would be good or practical?
I can see how it would be helpful. I think if you've got a young person that is really wants to know some information, it could be helpful to them. Again, like I say, it varies. And we're still you've got to think, I suppose, the actual existing legislation we've got in the UK, which was where the law changed from anonymous to open ID in 2005. Those young people are only just turning 18 over the last 18 months. So we still don't really know how that has panned out. Like, of those young 18, 19, 20-year-olds now, did they want that information younger, or was 18 okay? Is 18 a bit of an arbitrary number, or should it be younger? I think we don't really know at the moment. But I know that other countries like New Zealand, they adopt a very similar model to what you've explained there, Tracey, where parents on the behalf of their children can request the identifying info from any point from birth of the donor, and the donors consent to that when they donate. And I think that's gone okay. But again, they're a very small country, with small numbers of, and then most of I think pretty much all of their donors actually only come from New Zealand as well. So we don't really know. I mean, from my own personal perspective, I can see it would be a good idea. I think what I would worry about is where you've got a situation where identity is one thing, but relationships is something else. So, and sometimes, like I've seen, you can find an identity of someone and then it can become a relationship of sorts, whether loose or not. But it's having the kind of support there that, like, at what point does it become a relationship then with the donor? Like, what's the donor's role then in pre-18 contact? And that's what I would worry about with families specifically. It's like, how would they just be left to manage that with the donors? And you can imagine some of the scenarios would go a bit.
I think We Are Donor Conceived, the international organisation, and the Donor Sibling Register, there are lots of parents around the world who are DNA testing their children to find the donor or form connections with genetic half siblings. Just thinking about how significant it felt for you to meet Jonathan and see that genetic familiarity. One of the questions we've had is, did you feel like there was something you were missing before you found out? And it feels you've got a really good relationship with your parents.
Yeah. No, I to be honest, I didn't feel like I missed out at all. Like, I feel like, obviously it's hard for me because I can't imagine what it would be like to know Jonathan when I was younger. I can't put myself in that position. So I do find that quite hard to kind of, because people will say, would you have rather known him when you were younger? I really don't know. I genuinely can't put myself in that position. But I think I'm confident to say that I wish I knew I was donor conceived, because I didn't feel like I missed out. I had a wonderful childhood, and like I say, I'm so close to my dad. He's still the person in a crisis. I mean, he's nearly 80, and I'll ring him, for his advice. We have the most incredible relationship, and I have more respect for him in many ways, because I now know that he raised me when he knew that he didn't share genetics, at a time when society placed a lot of weight on genetic relationships still, and male infertility was real. Still is quite a big thing, and a big taboo and things like that. So I have a lot of respect for him. So I didn't feel like I missed out or felt like there was anything missing. But what I would say is that now I know who Jonathan is, and I know about him, there are certain things in my childhood, or just as in my identity, how kind of makes sense. So like, I have a medical condition with my eyes, a bit of a random one, and it's actually a genetic condition, and Jonathan has it. I was told growing up that my great aunt somebody or other had the condition, which was obviously not true. And those types of things, like my dad, he's ginger. I've been fair. My mum's very dark. And it was always a question when I was younger. And I remember saying to my mum, well, where do I get I had they used to call me the Milky Bar kid. I had bright blonde, white hair. And you look at photos of Jonathan at the same age, white hair, very fair skinned. And my mum, I remember being very quite defensive, because I remember being a child questioning him, well, where's this blonde hair come from? As a little kid. And my mum snapping at me a little bit, saying, well, your dad was blonde as a kid, that kind of thing. And I remember being like, well, why is she so defensive about it? And I think actually it's because it was poking at that she knew, obviously, that my dad and I didn't share genetics, and I had this white hair that no one in my family seemed to have. So those kinds of things. So I wouldn't say I don't feel like I missed out. In fact, actually, I'm so grateful my dad raised me, because I can't imagine having a better parent. And I'm forever grateful that the world somehow collided, meant that he got to raise me. But there are certain things that make more sense now that I know I'm going to consider.
Just thinking about your professional journey, at what point did there become a need to create resources? Because it feels that's your passion. It feels putting resources, information. I always think the professionals outside of the clinics themselves are a bit like the scaffolding, the infrastructure that hold people together as they move forwards. What drove that, and how did that start?
Yeah, so I can say I do work in this area now, and I work for an organisation called Path to Parenthood, which supports parents all the way through to considering donor conception, right through to parenting their children. And I kind of got involved, I think, initially through social media. Again, rightly or wrongly, everyone tends to go to social media these days to get their information. And I started, I suppose, I created an account actually just on Instagram, very basic account with a not very great, they call them handles, which is your name. It wasn't it was a bit of a random one. And I did a couple of talks with people that I'd met through Facebook, actually, on Instagram. They wanted me to do a bit of an Instagram live, and it kind of grew from there. My account just started to grow, and I started to get parents mostly actually asking me questions. And I think because I was in both camps, so I had donor conceived children and donor conceived, I think people maybe felt safe to ask me questions, and they just wanted my insight, I suppose. And that's kind of how it grew. And then, like I say, I met a lady called Becky Kearns, who is a mum through egg donation, who founded Path to Parenthood. And we just really clicked and really aligned in what we wanted to do. And I think there's fantastic people like yourself, Tracey, who do amazing work with the counselling support and all the rest of it. Clinics do a great job, I suppose, of actually creating the families in the first place. But what we were finding is that one, people really struggled sometimes with a lack of community. So they didn't really know anyone that was going through the process. But also they just wanted that extra kind of all the info and resources, like how would you talk to your child? Yeah, I mean, even like the DNA testing piece, you know, if you are considering it, what are the things that you need to consider with donor conception if you're going to DNA test your child? So we've had like researchers on that have done research into the impacts of DNA testing on donor conceived families, all that kind of stuff. And I just found a real passion, I think, in trying, I think, to the things that I really struggled with and the things that I saw my parents struggle with and the things that I'm now dealing with my children in a 2-mum family, which is very different. I wanted to try and what I'd learned, I suppose, maybe put into, like I say, to try and help others. And that's kind of where it's taken me, really. So.
And thinking of Path to Parenthood, is that just for people in the UK or is that international? Is that open to people?
Yeah, it's international. It did start initially as a UK-based support platform. Like I say, Becky is a mum through egg donation. So that's where the kind of, and she's got quite a large audience. She's defining mum on Instagram. So she's got quite a large platform there, but it just started to grow. And to the point that we are completely international. We have people from all over the world join us. And yeah, like I say, we've partnered now with a number of with a UK sperm bank and some clinics and they're actually, which is a dream of ours really, is that they've absorbed the cost of the membership. I mean, it's quite a low cost membership. It's around £16 a month for people, but the actual clinics and the banks now are realizing the how much it can help their patients and clients going through, especially going through the treatment process, to have that support and community. They're paying for the members, you know, the membership license for their patients. So we've partnered with Number now, and that side of things is growing, which is growing great. And it's brilliant because that's what we want at the end of the day, is more and more people to get access to the support in the community that's, you know, so often lacking.
Which is just beautiful. Are European clinics able to affiliate with you as well, or are they just in the UK at this time? Or
we're open to discussing with anyone. What I would say is that we do have, Becky and I feel very strongly, and funny enough, we were talking about this today actually, about our own values around the people that we collaborate with. So we do feel very strongly certain things to make sure that anyone we do work with, I suppose, kind of shares those values. So you know, you know, we're not open to everyone, but if you share our values around certain things, then yeah, we're always open to chatting. So
I guess I'm being a bit provocative now in just acknowledging there is still an awful lot of anonymous donor conception, especially around Europe. If families have embraced treatment in Spain, for example, but any country where donor conception is still anonymous, are they welcome? Are they supported? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think regardless of how you've come to donor conception, from a parent, like we support parents, and we support them regardless of how you've, you know, gone down that route. And I think like even Becky herself speaks very openly. She had treatment in Prague using a fully anonymous donor. And she does talk about, and again, this is what we try to do on the hub, is we're not here to say, this is how you should do it, this is how you shouldn't do it. You know, that's not our job. But what we do feel really passionate about, which is something that I noticed, I think, going through the process myself, is I didn't really feel my wife and I were fully informed, for example, around donor choice. When we were going through treatment, we were very much led by a clinic, which they were okay, but they didn't give us all of the information, for example, that we now know, things like worldwide limits and stuff. So what we tried to do on the hub is say, right, these are all the things you maybe want to consider. But we're very aware, you know, from my personal point of view, I always say to people, if you have an option to use an open ID donor, as opposed to a fully anonymous donor, then I would always say I would try and go for that, because you don't know how your child might feel. But similarly, I'm also realistic enough to know that many people either feel like they either live in a country that only allows anonymous donation, so, you know, they don't have maybe a lot of choice, or they might not be able to travel, or they don't have, you know, they don't fit a certain criteria to have treatment in their home country, or they just simply can't afford another round of treatment in their home country, in which point they have to maybe go to a country that only offers anonymous donation. And, you know, I'd love for everyone to offer open ID, but it's just not the reality at the moment.
But as you are evidence, if you have an anonymous donor, that doesn't necessarily mean it's anonymous. And if somebody is determined, feisty, that drive in there, again, you can access that information. But equally, there are lots and lots of donor conceived people who aren't interested,
Exactly.
or they're just too busy. There can be different triggers that come up in different times in life that prompt that curiosity.
Yeah, and I've met many donor conceived people that have no desire to find out any more information than what maybe the profile that they've given. They're accepting that it was an anonymous donor, and they've not ever really had that desire. But like I said, going back to, for those individuals where it is really important, it can make a huge difference to have just that photograph or that identifying info. So that's why I always sort of say, if and I appreciate I come from a very privileged position in being able to have treatment where I could use an open ID donor, my wife and I. There are lots of people that might even be listening to this where those options aren't simply available, and certainly would never, that's just the way it is. But it's being able to prepare that is your situation, and maybe trying to prepare your child, if you have a child for an anonymous donor, is preparing them for that, and being realistic with the expectations that they might have.
Again, it's claiming the narrative, that pathway to parenthood. We know children do best when they're wanted, and certainly it takes a desire, a drive to become a parent when you're embracing an assisted conception journey wherever it is in the world.
Yes, exactly. And I think what I've learned as well from my own situation is the support from your parents can mean such a difference. So, the fact that my dad has been very supportive of my curiosity, and I've no doubt he's had some insecurities about that. But actually having that support is freed me, if you like, to kind of pursue that. It hasn't changed my relationship with him, but actually having that support is meant that I've been able to kind of do what I needed to do. And that's kind of given me, I think, like with my own children now, they're still very young, but if they do want to know the identity, if they're the donor that was used to create them, they potentially obviously will have that info when they turn 18. But it will still be a bit like, I don't know how I feel about it at the moment of them wanting that info, but I do know what it's like to feel that curiosity and that desire to want to know. And I will do my best to kind of support them in that process, if that's what they want to do, and trying not to center it on myself and how I feel as their parent, even though it's hard because you still feel like, apprehensive about it.
We have just got a few minutes, but I'm just curious, and this is a bit of an odd question, but was there anyone to support your dad? Because I acknowledge that now we have Path to Parenthood, Donor Conception Network, there's lots of different donor conceived organisations and support. Was there anyone there for your dad?
No, I mean, not really. I kind of spoken to him about it, but he ex-military man, doesn't really share his feelings about any topic, to be honest. I did my, what I've always done is that I made a pact with myself and talked it through with my wife when I decided I was going to DNA test. I know many people don't tell their family that's what they're doing. But I wanted to break the cycle of secrets and the shame and all that kind of stuff. So although it was very difficult, I actually went and spoke to my parents and said, look, this is what I want to do. I want to keep you fully informed. If you don't want to know, that's fine, but I want you to know this is at least what I'm doing. And we've been able to keep an open dialogue between ourselves. But no, in terms of actually having support, no, not really. Not that I'm aware of, unless he sought it out himself.
Then what a gift you have given to parents in the future.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's all you can do is, like, I'm still learning as well. I mean, I think that's probably the biggest thing. I know what it's like to be donor conceived, but I'm still learning as a parent of donor conceived children. And my kids will have probably different experiences and challenges to what I've had. They're being raised by two mums, for example, and they're probably having more challenges around that actually at the moment at school, because they don't have a dad quite overtly at the playground, and they're getting asked about where their daddy is and all this kind of stuff. So we're dealing with that at the moment, and donor conception is something obviously we've talked to them about, but they're going off talking to their mates about, well, you need an egg and a sperm and a body to grow a baby in. And Mammy and Mama didn't have any sperm, so they asked a nice man to give them some sperm, and their mates are looking at us to go, "What the hell are you talking about?" So we're kind of going through that at the moment. So yeah, it's interesting times, but in a different way with them.
In a different way, but just past the parenthood, openness to collaborating, to hearing from others. It feels a beautifully safe space for people to dip into. Ollie has asked a question. Thanks, Ollie. At what age do you think it's best to talk about it? As a counsellor with my clients, I always say from when children are about 6 months old, so that you can get comfy with the words in your mouth before they're old enough to ask questions. So for a 2-year-old, I always say talk to their teddy when they're at nursery or asleep or at school, to have a practice beforehand. But what do you advise?
Yeah, I exactly the same, really, Tracy. I think some of those, there's lots of storybooks out there. Ollie, I'm not sure if you're aware of them. If you head over to my website, allthingsdonorconception.com, allthingsdonorconception.com, I'll put it in the chat. I've got a free resource on there which you can download, and it's got a list of some really good children's storybooks that you can buy, or some that you can buy and adapt to your own family setup. And it really gives you a script, actually, of how to have those really early conversations, because whilst we know that it's in the best interest of the donor conceived child to talk to them, before the age of 7, I think is probably what the research has suggested. But actually, the earlier the better. So like if you can get those conversations, like Tracey said, even before they're talking, you're getting yourself confident as parents in those conversations. So definitely have a look. And like I say, if you are worried about it, there's lots of support out there. Like I say, the resource I mentioned there, all, like I say, through the membership of Paths to Parent Hub, we've got like a whole series of webinars around how you introduce the story, that narrative, to your children when they're younger, at different ages, and what they can understand. Because of course our kids, as they get older, and they start to understand things differently. They my kids are nearly 8, and some of the questions we're getting are quite advanced, really. So the conversations you'll have, like say with your 2-year-old, will be very different to maybe the conversations you'll have with a 7 and 8-year-old, and that changes, and your confidence as parents will change as you get a bit more familiar with the story as well. But it is a process, I would say. So it's definitely a process.
It's a process, and I think it's so important for parents to be aware of support being available. In the UK, we have counselling has to be available from all the clinics, but there are so many different support organisations there and around Europe as well. Do you have a list on your website or Paths to Parent Hub website for international friends with international resources?
Yeah, so actually on my website, which I've just posted in the chat there, I've got the idea I wanted to set up my website is that if you're a donor conceived person, or a parent, or a professional even in the field, you can come to my website, and all of the things I've got on there, the signposting is all for free resources, or because there wasn't really a lot out there when I started looking. But yeah, most of those support networks, like we recommend the Donor Conception Network, for example, they do fantastic work here in the UK, but also internationally, and they're a charity. Obviously, like I say, the work we're doing on the hub, but it is very much an international, you'll find information and help there regardless of where you're from. But I do, what I would say is, working with parents from different parts of the world, there are nuances, I think, from living in different areas, understandably, whether cultural reasons, religious reasons, or like the laws of that country when it comes to donations. So it's always really great to maybe try and find, as well as an online community, if there's anything within your country, I think would always be quite helpful, just for that kind of level, that extra level of support, I suppose.
I've had people come to the UK from overseas for both Paths to Parenthood and Donor Conception Network events, because it is something quite powerful, special for meeting in person. Hayley, definitely. You've been a joy, and I could go on, forget hours, days asking you questions. There's so many things I didn't get around to asking. I may have to ask you back if that's okay.
No, thank you for having me, Tracey, and thank you for listening, everyone. And I appreciate some of you will be at completely different stages of the journey. Some of you are probably only maybe just considering donor conception, or some of you may even have children. But actually listening to these conversations is a huge step wherever you are. And just thank you for listening, because just by listening, you're probably doing so much more for your family than you realize. And like I say, my hope is that if you feel like you need the support, whether it's professional support through counselling like Tracey offers, or through like the membership communities that we've mentioned, I just hope that you're able to find that, because donor conception can be an amazing path, but it can also be quite challenging as well.
And that goes for professionals as well. So if you're part of a clinic or you're part of an organisation who wants to understand more about donor conception, then Hayley and the team at Path to Parenthood, again, open to affiliation and to talking. I think you do lots of public speaking and presentations as well. So please do reach out to Hayley if you've got any questions. But thank you everyone for joining or watching online if you're watching this later. Hayley, it's been great to meet you. Thank you so much for being along this evening, and thank you to everybody for being here. Take care and have a lovely rest of the evening.